Hello and welcome to my shop. This video is a follow-up review to my Grizzly G0700 sliding table saw. I've owned this saw for 16 months now and can finally give it a fair assessment. Now while Grizzly has discontinued this particular model, this video will hopefully be useful to people in the secondhand market or those interested in its big brother, the G0623X. That saw has the exact same internals but has a much more robust sliding table and outrigger system. So let's get started. So first I'll talk about what I do like on the saw. The first thing is power. The 5-horse motor has more than enough capability to handle what this hobbyist can throw at it. Enough said on that. The second is precision. For the most part, once you get the saw tuned up, it stays that way. The one exception is the Riving knife, which I'll talk about later. So for the fence and for the siding table, I've had to retune them, I think, twice each in the time that I've had the saw. But both operations are pretty straightforward and easy to do. You just need a long straight edge and a dial indicator and some wrenches. All the adjustments are out in the open and it's easy to see when you've got everything on the zero. The number one thing that I like about the saw has to be the sliding table. Even though this is about the smallest sliding table you're going to see on the market, there's no outrigger, it doesn't extend very far to either end of the saw. It still adds a ton of versatility and safety to the saw. So in addition to doing the normal crosscuts that you could do with a miter gauge and a normal cabinet saw, this thing takes the place of a ton of jigs. So for example, in the time that I've owned it, I've only ever had to make 2 jigs. The first is a really simple box joint jig, just a backer board and a little key. This thing just clamps down onto the table. And the second jig is a pair of wedgie bars. These are used for making segmented pieces for wood turning. And these are a good segue into the T-track. These little guys just fit into the T-track with some washers. And everyone knows that T-track is extremely versatile. So why not have that natively on your table saw? Anything your imagination can think of with T-track, boom, you have it on here. You don't need to make another jig to hold T-track or anything like that. So another good example is taking a piece of 1¼ flat stock from the hardware store and upgrading my Craig jig to work on both my table saw and my drill press. Cool stuff. So one last thing about the small format slider is around ripping. So one complaint, and a valid complaint I think, about large format sliders who are going to have the slider arm extend maybe out to here, is that traditional ripping is difficult. Well, that's not true with small format sliders like this. I can stand right here and I can see down the path where the board's going to be taken. In addition, I'm out of the line of fire and I can rip comfortably. But also notice that I'm standing inside where that large sliding arm would be. So if that were here, I'd be over here, which is a little more of an awkward ripping position. So I think the small format slider is a really good compromise in terms of getting sliding table versatility and traditional cabinet saw ripping ability. The next thing in the light column is going to be dust collection. I was pleasantly surprised with this overarm dust collector. It does a really good job of picking up all the small stuff. If you're cutting off just the end of a board, you're going to wind up with a little spray of schmutz over here on the table, but that's really not a big deal. In addition this saw does have a shroud underneath the saw blade, but it doesn't do a fantastic job of picking up all this stuff. So here's the bottom of the shroud. If you can see that, here's the tube that comes up into the bottom of it, but also inside the cabinet you can see plenty of junk. So every couple of months you'll need to vacuum this guy out. So I'm going to do a quick demo of the airflow through the overarm collector. So this thing is hooked up to a 2-horse Cyclone dust collector, and it does maybe, I don't know, 520 CFM at the saw. So a pretty good setup, but nothing crazy. Let's try it out. So I've got some planer chips here. And yeah, it does a nice job pulling them away. There certainly isn't a hurricane coming through this overarm collector, but in my experience, this has been plenty strong enough to keep my shop pretty clean. The last thing in the light column for me is the fence overall. As I said earlier, it holds calibration really well, and it's very versatile, letting you solve a number of problems in different ways. So it has a low and a high position, and also it can act as a depth stop for any kind of cross-cutting operation. I tend to keep this thing in the down position because I tend to work with a lot of plywood. And also I like that the down position lets you do really small rip cuts with the blade guard still on. In fact, I've never once removed the blade guard for any kind of cross-cutting or ripping operation. And that's solely because this fence with this low configuration can still let me use the push stick for this thing. The only time I've ever taken the blade guard off is for a non-through cut. So in the middle of the road or meh category is the table saw's scoring blade. I've never actually used it. The scoring blade is 1/8 of an inch wide, and from the get-go I bought these 3/32 Diablo blades, so this was always too wide for the blades I was using. And honestly, the combination of the saw and the blades do a very, very good job on plywood with basically no tear out. So I've never had the need to use a scoring blade. Perhaps if you did a lot of work with coated plywoods, you might need to use one, but for the work that I do, I haven't had the need. So if I had the opportunity to buy a sliding table saw without a scoring blade setup, I would do so just to save the money. Alright, now we're moving on to the dislike category. My first 3 dislikes are all in the guts. So for people interested in the 623, pay attention. My first complaint is that the Arbor needs to be cranked up fairly high to do any kind of blade changes. Let me demonstrate. So first I'm going to remove the riving knife and the blade guard for clarity's sake. Then I'll put in Arbor stop. There we go. All right. So here's the problem. With the blade at this height, I won't be able to remove it. So I'll demonstrate. Now I kind of suspect this is a problem because perhaps this model of table saw chassis was not designed to accept a dado arbor with this additional length. So basically the bottom of the blade gets caught on the dust shroud. So if I want to remove that guy, you have to come over here, raise the blade to about here where it can be taken off. Now that's really not a big deal for doing, if you're working with normal blades, but if you're doing dado work and you need to adjust the width of your dado stack in the middle of a sequence of work where you've already set the height, that's a huge pain in the butt because now you have to recalibrate the height of your saw if you ever need to change the width of your dado stack. So basically it teaches you to have an error-free and perfect workflow which are usually kind of hard to find. So that's my first complaint about the saw. The second one, which I can show you, actually I'm going to show you with the blade off, have to do with the shop-made throat inserts. So these inserts, let me set my blade down. These inserts, it's a piece of wood that bolts sideways into the table saw's top. Here's one that I have for one of my dado stacks to show you a little more clearly. So it's just a rectangle of wood with 4 countersunk holes in it. And they work fine because you can make zero clearance inserts. But my complaint is that they're fiddly to make. Ripping and thicknessing the wood isn't so bad, but getting the holes in the right location and countersinking them, kind of hoping that they fit, is fiddly. And furthermore, in order to get the insert perfectly flush with the top of the table, you have to make it proud initially. tighten it down, and then hand plane it smooth. I suppose you can make the holes a little bit oversized, but then it might wiggle around a little bit. I'll have to try that next time. But my complaint is that this is like a handcrafted little piece of wood, and it's kind of a disposable thing because eventually your dado stack, through raising this thing, is going to eat it down to nothing. And my final complaint while we're in this area is around the riving knife set block. So here's the little block the riving knife attaches into. The riving knife slides in here behind this washer, like so, and then you tighten this nut down and that secures it. I'm going to zoom you in on this little block. There we go. So there's just four holes here, and each one of these has a little grub screw that make positive contact on this plate here. And so these allow you to shift this block in any direction. And that's how you align the riving knife with the blade. And personally, I found that degree of freedom to be kind of annoying because it's really, really fiddly and repetitive to get the riving knife perfectly lined up with the blade, because the only time you can see if you've done a good job with fiddling with your little Allen wrench is after you've put the riving knife back in and tighten it down. So you get it back in there, tighten this down, then you can check your work. Then you take it back out, adjust something, put it back in, tighten. It's a pain in the butt. It's kind of like setting up a joiner. And my other complaint about this little guy is that it tends to move a lot. Earlier in the video when I said this thing was a precise table saw with one exception, this is the exception. Every couple of months my riving knife gets out of line with my blade, and I think it's because when I do non-through cuts I have the riving knife typically taken out, and that allows those little set screws to be loose, and they probably vibrate around and change position. So then when I put the riving knife back in, it's a little bit off, and that error compounds over time. So that's pretty annoying. Actually, this is my biggest complaint about this whole table saw is the riving knife setup. Because honestly, you'll be doing sort of a tricky rip operation or something like that, and then all of a sudden you discover that your riving knife is now wedged against your wood, trying to push it like into the blade or away from the blade or whatever, or the riving knife is pinching the wood against the fence. Annoying stuff. My number one thing to complain about right here. My final complaint about the saw is the repeatability of the miter gauge. And by repeatability, I mean your ability to get this thing back to 90 if you need to remove it. So if you're ripping a wide piece of material, you have to take the miter gauge off. And that means you need to loosen this, slide it out, do your work, and put it back. Now when you need to tighten it back down, you want this to be back at 90. So Grizzly does give you a little stop mechanism, which I'll zoom you in on. And the stop mechanism doesn't give me much confidence at all. So here's this little bar. This pulls out, and then these little bolts then rest against it. And that's how it's supposed to work. This little bar has some play, which is not a good thing. And furthermore, there's a little bit of play between the miter bar and the miter slot. So you're never really perfectly confident about where this thing is when you reposition it. So you'll have to figure out your own solution to re-squaring the miter fence with the blade each time you put it back in. I've taken to using an engineering square to line up the fence against the saw blade. It's not as perfect as doing the 5-sided cut and test, but I don't have time to do that each time I take this thing out. And frankly, that method has gotten me pretty good results so far. But obviously, I would prefer some sort of dead nuts accurate way to put the miter gauge back in and know that it's in precisely the same position I had it when I first took it out. So when I buy this saw again, I give that answer a conditional yes. I love the sliding format and the versatility that it gives, but this particular saw has a number of usability problems that, while aren't show-stopping, they are annoying enough to where I wish they weren't there. So if I was in the market for another one of these, assuming it wasn't discontinued, I would first do lots of research into European small format sliding saws. They cost more, and I've read a lot of horror stories on the woodworking forums about them not being so usable. So that might promote this kind of saw back up to the top. We'll see. Well, there you have it. That's my review. I hope it's been of some use to someone out there. So if there are any questions about the saw or my experience with it, leave them down below and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching. And while I have everything out, I might as well show you guys the runout in this guy. So here I have the Arbor with a piece of masking tape showing where the top is. And let's give this thing a whirl. I'm turning via the scoring blade. This is the most use I've ever gotten out of the scoring blade. So we made a whole lap, and as you can see, it basically shows no runout, or so little runout that this chintzy dial indicator can't even indicate it. The needle just wiggles when I move it along the surface. So I think that's one of the reasons this saw gives me such good cut quality, is that there's basically no runout. So good stuff, Grizzly.